what professional skills and rules of communication apply in research. I do think that for a lot of people who are starting out, they don't necessarily have work experience, or if they do, it's not in an office environment. And I find that a lot of research labs function similarly to offices, at least in terms of having professional email, having a dress code. And what I'm wondering for each of you to speak to is what guidelines for communication do you think are unique to research and might be less obvious, or what surprised you when you were starting out in that setting?
I don't know if anything comes to mind that is unique in research. In my experience, a lab, as you said, is like similar to an office, and professionalism should be treated as the same as it would if it were your first job. I think that in my experience in our lab, we understand that our undergrads maybe have not had a first job. And as such, we are really clear in our expectations. I think we even have a manual that covers all of our lab policies and professionalism and communication, all of that stuff. But on the flip side of that, we are also available as supervisors to have like really direct conversations about what is expected and what is appropriate. And so I think because in most labs, you will have a sort of point person who is a grad student who understands that maybe this is your first time doing this. I think it's okay to ask, like, if you aren't sure about something, is it appropriate? Would you prefer that I do it this way versus this way? And I think that most people are going to be willing to give you that feedback and guidance.
I also think that although we value independence and initiative, we really appreciate undergrads who are willing to ask us questions, even if it might seem like a small question, because we'd rather it be answered and the task be done correctly than us find out like weeks down the line that something wasn't happening that should have been happening. And I think in terms of communication, one of the things that is challenging for a lot of people is like the art of CCing people and who to CC and when, because a lot of times you have a grad student mentor, but then you might have a project supervisor, and then you have a PI, and there's a lot of different people. And so it could be hard to know who you're supposed to be communicating with and when. So to Janna's point, like making sure that is really clear and asking whoever your point person is, like, is this something somebody else should know? Should I be CCing somebody else on this email too? I think is really helpful.
Can I just jump in real quickly? Just
Please
for everybody who's listening, could you define what a PI is for everybody?
Yeah, so a PI is a principal investigator, and they are kind of the boss of the lab. And so they're the people who are guiding research questions, the research team, securing funding, and they're the faces of the projects that you're working on.
Great, thank you. I think that's a term that we all use, but
but someone else might hear as private eye.
Yeah, right.
They're a different kind of detective. They're solving research questions. I think those are really good points. That like there's a lot of overlap between the office space of the lab and any other office you might be in, right? And most places are very upfront about dress code, about requirements. One thing that I think about that kind of stands out to me as different is you're working with participants. And in developmental sciences, particularly, we work with a lot of families, right? Children come in, their parents come in. And so you're maintaining a professional environment in a way that I think if you're working in a wet lab, meaning a lab where you're doing like hard physical science, you're not working with people, you're working with specimens. And so then maybe the dress code is different, right? You have safety requirements, so you wear closed-toed shoes or goggles, but you're not trying to come across as a professional environment. You as an undergraduate researcher represent the lab to other people in a way that I don't think maybe was as obvious to me when I was first starting out. Like, oh, part of the job is kind of customer service. And I think that is a really important skill that I learned coming into those environments. So one thing that I wanted to ask you guys about is just specific examples or stories you have about, I mean, when you're thinking about mentees or people who have worked in your lab under you, what advice or tips would you want to give them starting out? what kind of wisdom do you want to pay forward to those people?
Okay, I can go first. So I think in our lab, Janna and I's lab, we've had the privilege of working with so many wonderful undergraduate students. And some of the ones that stand out to us in particular, at least to me, are the ones who really take initiative in the research and are interested in learning more about it from kind of a deeper standpoint. So we have a lot of undergrads who are great researchers who do the tasks that we ask them to do, and that's fine, but they had never really expressed interest in like why they're doing what they're doing and like where it's going in terms of how it's being applied like academically and in the context of research. And so the ones that really want to like dig in deeper to the methods and like the paper writing and analysis standpoint have been really wonderful. And it really shows us their ability to conduct independent research and allows us to write, like better letters of recommendation and apply for funding on their behalf because we know they're strong researchers and have the ability to think about our research from that methodological framework. So those are the ones that stand out to me.
My response is almost a direct echo of what Winston was going to say. But yeah, I think like it when you're an undergrad, you definitely get a sense of how laborious and sometimes time intensive research is. And sometimes the task that you're doing is hard to connect to the bigger picture. And I think we try, at least in our lab, to make sure that we're providing opportunities for that to happen. But the people that get the most out of it are those that really take initiative and, asking to do journal clubs together that are beyond what's being offered, or asking questions about how the task that they're doing filters into the bigger project. And so I think, yeah, like taking initiative really serves people well in terms of coming out of the experience, being able to really talk at a high level about the work you were contributing to and why it matters and things like that.
And I imagine that's something that really serves you well when it's time to apply to graduate programs, because then, like you're saying, Janna and Winston, you can identify what it was about the research you were doing that was important. And that can also help you identify what research you want to do next, if research is the next step for you. I also feel like that's just a general truism. A lot of experiences are what you make of them. So it's not just saying yes to opportunities, it's also seeking out opportunities. And I'm wondering what your personal experiences were doing that in your first research projects. What was that like? Was it scary?
Yeah, I think for me it was overwhelming because, you're learning so many different pieces of the puzzle at once. Like I'm thinking my first lab was an MRI lab. So it was like, trying to learn those analyses. And I was fortunate to have people that, let me know that all of those opportunities were available to me. But I do think it was overwhelming in terms of like, how do you choose which components you're interested in or which things you want to learn more about? And I think that's something that as a undergraduate student supervisor, those are conversations I try to have with my mentees about like, well, what do we think your long-term goals are? Are there any things that are sticking out as interesting to you? Okay, here's an idea of maybe an area that you should get more involved in the lab because it sounds like a skill or topic that you want to learn more about.
Yeah, I will say it was an interesting experience for me in grad school because I revisited my first research projects that I did before grad school to try to turn them into publications. And I ended up having to redo absolutely everything I did as an undergrad, which is totally fine. Like it was an analysis. Like I was clear that like I didn't grasp all the pieces when I was in undergrad, which is totally fine. And so I think using that example as well as like in our undergrad research projects that we have in our lab, like really emphasizing growth and that like you can do something wrong and that is okay and we can go back and learn how to do it and fix it later. And so we have our undergrads write independent study papers the first quarter, and then the subsequent quarters we have them revise it. And so a lot of times undergrads don't really have the opportunity to revisit papers after they're turned in, and the process of revisions ends up being really daunting to them. And I know was for me when I started research. And so knowing that like revisions and editing is part of the process, and that getting feedback and taking feedback is a really important part of research. And that's also something we look for in our undergrads, are those who can accept feedback, apply it, and make those adjustments and other things moving forward.
It's also helpful to be able to do peer review and to give each other feedback. I think that's a skill set that's difficult to learn. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. But I think especially for those students who are interested in graduate school and beyond, you have to develop a thick skin, but you also have to be able to help guide other people's work and edit their work in a constructive way. So it's definitely a skill.
I think it's also a mindset, right? For me, when I'm getting feedback, and I get a lot of it as a graduate student, it helps for me to think of it as, oh, this is something I didn't know that I'm learning. And I definitely see that being daunting when you're in undergraduate and you're used to having a syllabus. And so, like Winston says, you turn in a paper and it's done. You get a grade, you know what you need to do to make the A, and everything's very straightforward and laid out for you. And that's definitely not the case as you move up higher in research, right? Like Jessica's saying, when you're in the peer review process, publishing papers, when you're submitting grants and different funding boards are telling you everything that's bad about your idea, being able to see it as not something personal or not an indictment of your intelligence or ability, but instead, okay, well, the whole point of doing this is to discover something I didn't know yet. The whole point of peer review is for my peers to tell me what things I might be missing or what I've got right. And so that feedback becomes really valuable, I think, when you look at it from that standpoint. And that definitely is a professional skill to learn. The fact that, someone says, oh, here's something you can do better next time. To be able to say thank you to that and mean it instead of feel defensive, I think is really important.
I do think that is like one of the scariest adjustments that you make, especially if you're an undergrad like at Northwestern, where like, these kids are very high achieving, they're used to getting A's, they're probably a little perfectionist, just like I'm sure we all are. So like the first time you get negative feedback feels really tough. But I feel like once you sort of get over that hump of like accepting that this is a part of the process, it's like one of my favorite parts of grad school now, because there are so many opportunities for feedback and figuring out what your strengths are and your weaknesses are. I feel like that's where the most growth comes from. And I have seen my undergrad sort of have that trajectory of a response where like the first round of revisions, they get really overwhelmed and they're like, feeling like they did a really good job. And I'm like, you did do a really good job, but this isn't the best version of the paper, right? It's not about whether you did a good job or a bad job. It's just about how do we make this better? And your first draft is never the best draft. And that's true for all of us, still.
Yeah, I think that's amazing advice. And I also think that, like, coming back to the original idea of, what should people know from a professional mindset or standpoint coming into a lab? What sort of guidelines for communication would you want to put forth to someone just starting out? I think one thing is being able to acknowledge that you might not know how to do something. That's something I've heard you both say, right? Asking for help or asking for specific guidance and saying, okay, I don't know exactly who you want me to CC on this email, so who should I include? Or something like, I'm unsure about how this procedure goes and I couldn't find it in the manual. Can you help me? And then also being able to acknowledge if you've made a mistake. That feels like one of the things I'm most glad to have learned before I got to grad school, is how to be able to own errors, because everyone makes them because they're human. And it's really something that I value in my undergraduates as well, those I work with, them being able to say, hey, look, I think I messed this up and I'm really sorry, but I want to make sure you know, because it affects the data or it affects the research. And so that kind of honesty, coupled with, again, a lack of defensiveness or an ability to say, I'm learning this, I'm growing, this is all part of my professional development and growth, and not, a problem with me as a human being.